Okay, so this is part 2 of supply management. Part 1 was all about procurement. Okay. Now you would have, even in the readings or otherwise, you would have heard a big debate about outsourcing, whether to outsource or not outsource. You might have heard it in the news. You might have heard the news about reshoring, nearshoring, all of these terms. Okay? And the usual understanding people have is that outsourcing is you ask some other company to do part of what you used to do, like make a component for you, and usually the other company is somewhere far away. Okay? And so there's kind of like two things people talk about. Either you have full ownership, high ownership, and you're close to the customer in the same country as the customer, so you're either here, which is you do things yourself, or you are up here where you have no control, direct control, because it's your supplier now, and the supplier is in a faraway country. So these are the two extreme poles that people usually talk about. But it's not an either or question. There is lots of different places to be on this plane. So on the x-axis we have how much ownership or control you have of the entire process. Obviously if you do something within your own organization, you're going to have a higher level of control. You can fire people, change the process. Everything is under your control, right? On the other axis we have the distance from your customer, which is are you producing in the same state or country or city, or are you producing far away? Now if you look at things that we produce ourselves, our own organization, I call them in-house, so we're doing it in-house. You have multiple options. You could be producing in-house close to the customer. Let's call it onshore to make it an opposite of offshore. You could be producing it in your own organization but in a neighboring country or state, which would be near shore, or you could be producing in your own organization but producing it far away offshore. Okay? So Tesla factory in California would be in-house and onshore, right? Tesla owns it, controls it, in the same country as they're selling the cars for the most part. What about the Tesla factory in China, which is going up soon? It is Tesla's factory. Which of these three would that be? Depends. If they produce cars there to sell in the US, it will be in-house offshore. But if they produce cars there to sell in China, it will be in-house onshore again, right? So it depends what their capacity planning is. If most production goes to China, Chinese market, it will be in-house and onshore. But if a significant amount of production goes to Europe and USA, then it will be in-house and offshore, right? So it would depend on what the demand of that factory is going to look like, right? Similarly, if you go to a third party, you have three options. A lot of times we do outsourcing to a supplier who's right next door. A lot of Toyota suppliers tend to co-locate with Toyota, and they're right next door. So they are third party, which is you're outsourcing, and you're still onshore. They're right next to you, right? Or it could be a supplier in a nearby country, or it could be a supplier far away. So again, you have all three options. Okay? So it's not just two options, outsourcing versus in-house, and one is there, one is there. You have lots of options in in-house, you have lots of options in outsourcing. So the middle is empty. Do you think there's something in the middle? Or what would go in the middle?
So if you're talking about side to side, would be something you partially own?
Excellent, yes. So there are a lot of hybrid structures that can go there. So you don't outsource completely to another company, and you don't have completely your own operations. So the most common, or I guess the most well-known example would be a joint venture. So you say we want to produce something, we have some of the technology, somebody else has some of the technology, or somebody else has other skills they bring to it, and so we will set up a joint venture. That joint venture could be onshore, near shore, offshore, again, could be anywhere globally, right? So it doesn't have to be here. There are other options for hybrid structures. It's not always a joint venture. Maybe you are going to another country because they have skilled labor of a particular type of skilled labor that you want to use. So you set up your but there's no supplier there with the equipment you want. Maybe it's expensive equipment. So you buy the equipment and you hire a supplier to provide the labor and do the actual production. So you don't pay the supplier as much because they are not providing their own equipment. You are furnishing the equipment, but it could be a hybrid structure in something like that. So there are other forms of hybrid structure that are possible. You saw some of them in one of the first cases we did about Crocs, where sometimes they owned the warehouse and somebody else had the staff in it. Sometimes the staff, the factory was owned by somebody else and it was their staff in it, things like that, right? So you could do all sorts of hybrid structures in the middle where two different companies both have control of that facility and that facility. Now, one type of structure which is and also a very common hybrid structure is you're actually kind of even between these two. So you kind of tell us a company to produce something for you or produce everything for you. And it could be far away, near shore, offshore. And then you set up a quality control office within that factory. So the only thing that's within your control is the quality control people who have their own office and they report to you. But the whole other factory belongs to the supplier. Okay? So it would again be something like a hybrid structure, although you don't have ownership and control over the production process, but your employees guarantee that the product is made to spec and to certain quality standards. Okay? So think of not as two options, but think of the whole plane in two dimensions where you could be at any point in the plane with some sort of structure and setup. Okay? So I don't want the readings or the terms outsourcing, nearshoring, offshoring to limit you to two or three options. There are actually, millions or infinite number of options where you pick and choose what's best for your supply chain. And for a given product or component, sometimes companies will not even pick one point, they will combine. So in this case, a company might say, in this part, we're going to have our own factory far away produce this part, some volume, and we're going to have an outside supplier also far off, but outsource some of the volume. Why would a company ever do something like this? Sounds kind of like crazy. They're doing two things. So if you need 100,000 pieces, maybe your factory makes some of them, half of them, and a supplier makes half of them, and then they both ship to your other plant or other operations where you need them. Would it have any advantages or?
Gives you some flexibility depending on demand.
Right. So if your demand falls low, you don't order from the supplier anymore, but you keep your factory running. You want the utilizations high and the cost to be low, right? So if demand fluctuates a lot, you could say, well, I know my demand is at least 50,000 a year, and then it could go up to 120, 130. So the variable portion I will outsource to one or multiple suppliers, and the part I'm sure about, I will set up a factory which is optimized to produce 50,000 at a very low cost myself, right? So you do both things. So overflow volume goes to suppliers, predicted stable volume goes to your facility. Okay. Okay. You could do any sort of combination you want. So you could have your own factory near the customer and then a hybrid setup near shore. Again, if you have a stable volume going to this onshore factory, you could give fast delivery most of the time to your customers. And if overflow volume goes there, if lead times are important, you have a slightly longer lead time for some of the orders, but a lot of the orders get very short lead time, for example. Okay. Any other reasons you would do this sort of mixture where you produce something other than just giving the overflow volume? Why else might you want to go to an external party to do something you also do in-house and you keep it in-house as well? What any other reasons you could think of why somebody might do that? Okay, let's make it more concrete. Let's say a car manufacturer is going to start producing electric cars, okay? And they are thinking whether they should make the batteries for the electric car or not. One option is they could make the batteries themselves. One option is they could buy batteries from a good battery manufacturer. But those are not the only two options. Another option is make some volumes yourself and also buy some from outside. Right, so Yeah, that is a good point. Maybe Tesla has better battery tech, so in your high-end model you put Tesla batteries, longer range, whatever, and other models you put your low-cost, whatever, your own battery. And maybe there's technology other people have where you do want to outsource to get that technology, but for some of the things you want to keep it in source. That could be another reason you would do both, right? Any other reasons you might want to do both? Yes, it would reduce risk. What sort of risk though? What risk would it reduce? Well, it would reduce many risks, but which ones, for example? Right, so you talked about the 2+1 sourcing, but you could do it more cheaply by just having 2 suppliers. But if there were no 2 suppliers, it was a very niche product, then might you want to do it in-house as well and outsource it. The supplier goes down or something happens, you have some production here, right? But a cheaper way might be just to have 2 suppliers for that, but you're right. Okay, think about it this way. Let's say you are a large company, makes a lot of different things, and you make some parts which go in your product which are really important. So if you're a cell phone manufacturer, maybe the chip that communicates with the cell phone tower is really important, because if that chip doesn't work well, the call quality goes down, people don't buy your phone, things like that, right? So let's say you make the phone, you make that chip as well. How do you know, or how do you ensure that the people within your company that make that chip make the highest quality, lowest cost version of the chip that is possible to make? Because if I am the chip making group, I am guaranteed you're gonna use my services. I'm in your company. So how would you make sure that this is the lowest cost, best quality chip that the internal group is making, right? Because the issue then becomes the internal group has no competition. They don't have to fight for demand, earn the demand. You are going to go to that internal group all the time because they are your company. So how do we make sure that they are, the top notch? Right, so you can say, okay, this internal group will produce the chip, but I'm also going to source some volume from an outside supplier of the same specs. So if the internal group now knows if they lag behind on quality or cost, things like that, you will start switching more and more volume to the outside supplier, and they will get more and more redundant. So now they have some competition to keep things at the highest level. Now, let's say this company starts making a new version of cell phone for which they need some new type of chip which didn't used to be in cell phone before. Think about, let's say we just added fingerprint readers to cell phones. So this cell phone company has never made a fingerprint reader, they don't know how to make them, and now they have to put a fingerprint reader into their cell phone. Okay. Again, they could go to a supplier, they could produce it in-house, or they could do both. If you are doing both, does that give you any advantage when you go to a supplier? Because the supplier knows you might just do all the volume in-house, for example. Right, so they know that this company can or is developing the technology in-house as well. So, we can't hold them hostage to this. They might just dunk us and go all in-house. So the same thing as the internal group, but the reverse of that. The other thing it might give you an advantage is that if you have that capability in-house, you would know exactly how much the thing costs. And a supplier can say, oh, this costs this much, or this costs this much, or this takes this much R&D effort. You know exactly what's involved in the production of that thing, so you can negotiate better in that sense. If you have no idea how that thing is produced, then somebody could tell you whatever. You might have to believe them. You don't know any better, right? So sometimes there are advantages to not just be at one point, but be at multiple points in this plane. Okay. Now the decision on where to be in this plane, which we are going to call the outsourcing kind of decision. In short, we just have to give it a name, but it doesn't have to be complete outsourcing. It could be hybrid, could be offshoring, things like that. That decision is a strategic decision. Why? Because it's hard to back out of it in the short term. So if you've outsourced to a supplier and you don't do it in-house, it's hard to develop the capability in-house on a short notice. It's hard to change suppliers on a short notice. So usually you're planning a few years out, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years when you make this decision. I'm going to talk about 3 issues or questions we want to answer about these decisions. What is, will going to a third party increase supply chain profits? Okay? If it increases supply chain profits, then we can negotiate terms to split the profit however we each want. If we have a lot of negotiating power, we might keep most of the profit. If they have more negotiating power, they may keep more, but at least the total profit in the supply chain, does it go up or not? What happens to risks? And are there other reasons other than costs and risks to outsource? Okay? So at the very least, you always have to look at costs and risks. So if you see the case for Thursday, question in the final exam, it's about outsourcing or offshoring, at least you should have some discussion of the costs and some discussion of the risk. And maybe there are other factors too, but at least risk and cost should always be part of the discussion. Okay, so let's look at some benefits which can increase our profits. Sometimes a supplier may have higher capability. Why? Because a lot of products use many different technologies, many different parts. It can be difficult for one company to be at the high end of technology or at the leading edge of technology for all those different things. Think about how many technologies a car uses, especially a modern car with some automated systems in it. Think about how many I was looking at a lot of computer science people going to work for car manufacturers in the recent years, where that wouldn't be their target industry 10, 20 years before. They would go to Silicon Valley, things like that. But now a lot of programming goes into cars, for example, right? So it may not be possible for you to be leading edge in every single technology you need for your product, and so one supplier may specialize more. Could be lower costs, again due to specialization and other reasons we'll talk about in the next slide. Better economies of scale. The supplier may have been doing that thing for a long time, right? So think about, anybody remember BlackBerry? Because you guys are still old enough to know what BlackBerry is. Great. So BlackBerry started off as a company specializing in secure communications. They had this device which a lot of companies liked because the email messaging done over the device was very secure. So if you were a company and your employees used that device to communicate, their plans, like design plans, things like that, is less chance they could be hacked and stolen by competition, things like that. So they were a company specializing in secure communications. Then they didn't innovate enough. Somebody working there told me that when the first iPhone came out, BlackBerry used to make jokes internally that who would ever buy a touch screen over a real keyboard on a phone. Like they would make these jokes and share them over email and stuff like that. Whereas the opposite happened, nobody wanted a physical keyboard, everyone wanted a touch screen eventually, right? Anyway, so their main business went kaput, right? What have they reinvented themselves as? They've said, well, a lot of things is the age of Internet of Things, where things are going to be talking to each other, like your refrigerator, right, might be connected to the internet and might give you details about something is going bad, what not, right? There are some toilets which will analyze whatever you do in the toilet and give you a report over email or something. So a lot of things are getting connected to the internet. So all these things, they might have your healthcare data, your urine test results, what food you eat, a lot of private data that they need to securely communicate, and so they are going into that industry now. So they are setting up, they made an operating system for cars to communicate with each other. They're making software and operating system for these devices to communicate with each other in a secure manner. Homes are getting more and more connected to the internet, for example, right? You have door locks which you can open through the internet, through apps, stuff like that. So they reinvented themselves into that market. So imagine you make an Wi-Fi connected door lock, or you make a refrigerator which needs to communicate with the internet now. It's going to be much harder for you to develop the software, a secure piece of software which is going to work in that device. So you might go to BlackBerry and you might outsource that. Okay, you make the software kind of for us, right? You may not have expertise because this technology has started being used in your industry, used in other industries before, where you may have suppliers from that industry who have more knowledge of that technology. Okay, reduction in fixed costs. This is actually, we already kind of mentioned it when you have in-house production and outsourced production, where you send steady predictable volumes to your factory and send the variable part of the demand to the outsourced factory. So same idea here. A supplier might be supplying 4 different players in the industry. So the demand they see has less fluctuation because if Macy's does well and Kohl's doesn't do well, the guy making fabrics for both of them, he will see constant demand because one went down, one went up, right? So the ups and downs will cancel out. So you could have a reduction in fixed costs because as a company, for you, it's a variable cost now. You pay a supplier to make it per part. And if there's a lot of volatility, fixed costs can be bad in volatility. If demand goes down, you still have to pay the fixed cost. By converting fixed cost to variable cost, you can more easily control your cost with volatility. And then the supplier, the risk is passed on to the supplier, which might be in a better position to hedge that risk because that one supplier may supply to different companies and maybe even different industries. Sometimes you need services where you are not the expert. So in some cases, you have enough volumes where you can be the expert. So Walmart would do a lot of their own transportation. They have enough volumes that they can develop expertise in transportation and logistics. But other companies may not do their own transportation. They may hire a transportation company. You may hire a distribution company, you may hire a warehousing company, things like that, because they are not experts at doing that, right? And they may not have the volumes to be able to scale up to that. Before we go forward, let's do a quick exercise. Think about, let's say some of you or a lot of you might live in a rental where something goes wrong, just call the landlord, hey, fix this thing. But if you don't live in a rental, something goes wrong in your home, and the decision is either you fix it yourself or you call a handyman or a professional to come fix it. How do you make that decision, and what variables impact that decision? So you look at your capability, right? Am I capable? Is it within my capability? If it's not, you'll outsource, right? So capability is one. Right, so if the job needs some special tool you don't have, if you have it, you might do it yourself. But if you don't have that special tool, you might say, well, the tool's going to cost me this much money. I may not use it again for years, so maybe I should just hire a handyman. So that would be like the equipment required may be general purpose or specialized. If it's general purpose, you can use the screwdriver in many places around the home. You'll just buy the screwdriver, do it yourself. But if it's not that general purpose, then you might say, I don't want to buy this special purpose equipment and keep it in my garage all this time. Let me just pay somebody once to fix it for me, right? So general purpose versus special purpose equipment. Excellent. Right. So again, quality might be concerned. Yes, I can do it. But especially if it's something to do with plumbing, you don't want to leak. And if I am not 100%, my quality is going to be the same or not look as good. You may outsource it, right? Right, so if outsourcing is extremely expensive, if that person come home and make a bill of $800, you might say, forget about quality and capability, I'm going to learn, and I'm going to do it myself, I'm not going to shell out $800 or something, right? So you might develop that capability because developing that capability still might cost you less if the outsourcing option is too expensive. So costs are always a factor in these decisions. Time, right? It might take you longer because you don't do it on a day-to-day basis. And in the company example, as you're launching a new product, a lot of times the first time a new product is launched, a lot of things might be outsourced just to meet that launch deadline. Whereas later on, then you might start producing some of them eventually in-house, right? So think about Apple. When Apple started, Apple did not make the touch screen. Samsung did, then LG did. Apple did not make their own chip. Right, they use Qualcomm chips, other companies' chips, but now Apple has designed their own chip that goes in iPhones and iPads. They have pretty much designed their own screen, and they maybe they should outsource it, but it's their design, for example, right? So they've brought a lot of those critical components in-house after initially outsourcing them because of the time factor. They didn't want to spend so many years developing each piece individually and then launch the iPhone. They want to launch the iPhone and then think about that. Excellent point, right? So it's very similar in that respect. A lot of these decisions we already make on a personal life basis. When you go to a company level, it's the same type of factors that you have to think about. Okay. Now, when you do go to a third party, a lot of the advantages in terms of total supply chain costs have to do with this idea of aggregation. Okay. If you are a small operation dealing with highly variable demand, your costs are going to be very high. Your cost will come down as you become larger because of economies of scale, or as demand becomes more stable, or you can hedge demand from different regions or different products, things like that, right? Because variability will drive costs, and low demand coupled with fixed investment or specialized equipment will drive your costs. So a lot of times suppliers can reduce those costs because of aggregation. There are cases where a supplier just supplies to one company, but the usual case is a supplier is usually going to be supplying to more than one customer, right? So they aggregate demand across different customers, across different regions. They can aggregate production for a bigger volume because they're not just producing the part for you, but multiple companies. Because of all these aggregation effects, they can sometimes have much lower cost than you individually. Okay? Think of it this way. Actually, that's actually a real example, but actually let's just go through. There are examples in here. So look at this example here. You have 3 or 4 car companies which make their own automobiles. But each of these companies has 1 or 2 models which are sold in very low volumes. So they're very specialty type of models, only some customers buy, and this company produces them in very low volumes. For each of these 3 or 4 companies, it might not be feasible to set up a whole assembly line for these models sold in low volumes. But if these 3 or 4 companies combine their volumes together and go to a supplier where they have somewhat of a flexible assembly line which can switch between these 3 or 4 models, this assembly line the supplier sets up may have sufficient volume from 3 or 4 car manufacturers to set up a separate line for these 3 or 4 models, right? So you could have something like that where 3 or 4 companies outsource production of low volume product to one supplier, and that supplier can meet their demand. We already have talked about inventory aggregation when we did the distribution part. Remember the square root law? Okay, so that was talking about just one company, but imagine let's say in northern Michigan, where there's not as much population, there's like smaller cities or towns. You have 3 or 4 grocery chains competing for business. You have Kroger, Myers, who else is usually in Michigan? Let's say you have 3 or 4 grocery chains competing for business. Now, it might be that they need to set up a warehouse in northern Michigan because somewhere here might be too far off. Now, if each of these 3 or 4 companies sets up their own warehouse, this is going to be very expensive for them because they may not have the volumes as an individual company to have a large automated warehouse being fully utilized, right? So I'll set up a small manual operation, or they'll have a lot of low utilization. But what these 3 or 4 companies can do, they can go to one warehouse or distribution company and say, we will put our products in your warehouse. For this one distribution company, it might make sense to have one huge warehouse where they store product from Kroger, Myers, all these other chains. And now they have the volumes, this one distributor, to have high utilization in the warehouse, to have a big automated warehouse, cut the cost, things like that. Does that make sense? Right? So by going to a third party, because they get business from multiple companies, they can cut costs by inventory, aggregating not just capacity, but also aggregating inventory. Same idea with transportation. Imagine you're distributing spare parts to all these dealerships and repair shops. If each car manufacturer does their own distribution trucks for spare parts, you'll have a lot of distribution trucks running around, going to all these repair shops and dealerships, dropping off parts for just one car manufacturer. Where it makes a lot more sense to outsource distribution of spare parts to a third party, because that third party in the same truck could carry Chrysler parts and GM parts and Ford parts and just make one route, right? Versus having 3 routes. Okay, I talk about warehousing. So all these reasons are kind of why distributors still exist. You'll not ask, it will not be very common to find a distributor which works just for one company or one brand, but you see distributors will still exist in many places where they serve many different customers and many different brands because of this advantages of aggregation. Okay, we see the same thing everywhere. Procurement aggregation. You see a lot in healthcare. Hospitals, come together, make one big buying organization, club their volumes together, buy in bulk for that. So that buying organization is a third party. Each hospital outsources their procurement to that buying organization. Right? Other industries might do the same. Information aggregation. So you have companies where all they do is bring together different parties who might trade by doing some sort of information aggregation. So, eBay is one example. 6 and 8 are connected. It's usually you do both of them together, because for relationship aggregation you have to do information aggregation. You bring multiple parties together so they can trade. You get a small slice of their transactions. Okay. Right. In addition to all of the above, we already talked about specialization. A company can focus, specialize on one thing, be really good at it, versus trying to be good at many different things. Okay. Now, when are these benefits we talked about, these 9 benefits, high or low? These 9 benefits are driven by 3 factors, and we already mentioned these 3 factors in our example of outsourcing to a handyman or doing the job ourselves. One is size, right? If there are economies of scale, aggregation is going to help you in all sorts of ways: capacity, inventory, transportation, all those ways. So if you are a company where you go into certain operation where you have a very small scale of the certain operation, it makes sense to outsource some parts of that, because at your small scale you may not have the cost advantage until you can scale up. Second factor is, so same thing as your home example. If you're going to do this job just once in 5 years, you might hire a handyman. You're going to be doing this thing every few months. You might learn how to do it yourself. It's similar to size. The second one has to do with uncertainty or volatility. If there's a lot of volatility, there's a lot of variability, there's more advantages from aggregation versus there's not a lot of variability. If things are stable and you can plan for them, you might find a cost-effective way to do that. If things are variable, then somebody who aggregates demand from different companies is going to do better. And the third one is, do you need specific equipment or general purpose equipment? In this case, from the supplier perspective, if your part is very highly customized and that supplier can't use the knowledge or skills or equipment in any other order, then there's not much benefit from aggregation for that supplier, so you might as well do it in-house. But if there are transferable things where whatever the supplier builds for you, they can transfer some of that technology and pieces to other orders from other customers, then there are going to be benefits of aggregation, and it makes more sense to outsource to that supplier. Okay, so this is just a table form of what this previous slides discussed. We're going to skip that, just putting the same thing in a table. Okay. So in addition to aggregation, we should always remember the issue of specialization and learning and quality. When I like to remember this, I always like to think about cars and tires. The way you make tires is a very different process than the way you assemble a car. Tires are more from a chemical process. You buy rubber, you mix it with different things, you kind of melt it, you get kind of, very different chemical industry type of process, which is making a car is a very mechanical type of process, right? And so it makes a lot of sense for automobile manufacturers to say, we're not going to build tires, somebody else build tires, because they can specialize in the chemical aspect of it, and we can specialize in the mechanical aspect of the car, for example. Okay, let's go to the other side. What are the risks of outsourcing? The first one should be familiar with you. If you remember back to the root beer game we did in class, the longer your supply chain, the more the players in it, the harder it is to coordinate the supply chain. The bigger the bullwhip effect will be, the more the players there are, the more work you have to do to align incentives, things like that. So when you start outsourcing, you make the supply chain longer, there are more and more players in the supply chain. So the first thing you have to look out for is things like the bullwhip effect, incentive alignment, all those issues, because now more than one player has to work together to get things right for the final customer. Okay. The other risks come from where the party is located. So if you are selling to a distributor who then sells to the end customer, then you are losing that touch from the end customer. So let's say these days you can still keep that relationship over the internet, for example. So let's say you make shoes, you sell them through a distributor like Crocs, like you give them a distributor who gives them to retailers. How do you know how the customer is reacting to your shoes? What is the feedback from the market? How was Crocs able to get that? They had to have their own sales staff go to the retail places, right? So you can still do that, but if you're not doing that next part yourself, then you have to have some way to counter the issue that somebody else is coming between you and the end customer. Loss of internal capability. If you stop doing something completely and you completely outsource it, you're going to lose the people who are expert in that. You're going to lose the knowledge. 2-3 years down the line, you say, okay, I want to do it again. It might be much harder to get back to where you used to be because you have to relearn how to do it. Leakage of sensitive data and information. Where do you guys think every year you get the leaked iPhone picture and specs before the iPhone is launched? Where do you think it leaks from in the supply chain? Well, one place it leaks from is sometimes, they build prototypes and Apple employees use those prototypes. There have been issues where they left it at the bar or something and somebody else picked it up, right? And they realized it was a newer version. There's not any iPhone in the market, for example. So that's one place. Where else do you think those designs leak from? Nobody's an iPhone fan. Nobody follows that sort of stuff, Rich? Right. Often they'll leak from Asia where they do their manufacturing because, if the iPhone is going to launch on a particular date, the manufacturing starts months before. And design is finalized months before. So those designs are shipped to Asia. Yes, Shane?
Another one of those.
Exactly. Third-party manufacturers where you send and for cases too where you have to get the cases with it, right? Yeah. So the cases one would be how it looks like, the notch, the shape, things like that. But you may not know exactly what new camera is on it. But the manufacturer side would know every single thing, every single component. And so you get leaks from your supply chain. So, the sensitive data, all that is also a big concern when you are outsourcing. And the third one has to do with incentive alignment. It may be hard to set up a contract where, your incentives are completely aligned. An example is what companies sometimes used to do. They would tell their supplier, you open your books to us, we will see your cost and we'll give you cost plus this % as price. If you do that, what's the incentive for a supplier to improve their cost year upon year? They have no incentive because even if they improve their cost, they can't keep the cost advantage. It's going to be cost plus 5%. So the higher cost is better because 5% of a higher number is bigger than 5% of a lower number. Just keep your costs high and just be comfortable. No need to improve your cost, for example. So, it can sometimes be hard to align incentives depending on how you set it up. Okay. Now let's go to the third question. Other than costs and risks, what could be other factors why we might want to outsource? So think about Google, and Waymo is a company which is working on self-driving car tech, started by Google, then Google spun it off. It's no longer part of Google now. Might be still part of Alphabet, the holding company of Google or something, but it's not Google, right? So why did Google do that? Because Google is a tech company. Investors want to analyze it, evaluate it as a tech company, and it becomes really hard to evaluate and value a company when it's in many different industries. So Google was saying if Waymo is in a risky business, we don't know if self-driving technology will take off, how long it will take, blah, 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 that risk is going to affect Google's stock price and valuation if you keep it on Google's books. So that's a financial argument. The other argument is Google might say, well, we have been hiring people and we have expertise in hiring, developing products for the internet. We hire web developers, that sort of technology. Now we've also started to hire people for car driving technology. Although there's some overlap, we have these two very different groups of people with different skill sets, and if they're in the same company, then both of these groups have to report to somebody in the same company. If that somebody comes from the web or google.com group, they're more focused on web technology, they don't know about the car tech. If that person they report to comes from the car side, they don't know about the other side. So it's going to be hard to manage a company which is in very different areas of business. So you want to focus. So two focused companies can often do better than one unfocused broad company because of the hierarchical nature of management. As you go higher and higher, you have to have one person who knows everything the company does, and that's person going to be harder and harder to find. Okay? Then the other thing could be other considered like business strategy. So marketing might say that made in home country slogan has a certain market value. So even though costs might be higher or lower, the marketing aspect will cover for that cost. You might still go with that issue, for example. In other industries, a company might say we have to be very sustainable and ethical in production because our customer cares about that, and if we are not, then the customer will switch to a rival, and so we are only going to outsource very carefully or not outsource, because then we can't control what happens on the supplier end. And as I talked about before, consumers don't care whether it was you or your supplier. Any issue in your supply chain, the company which puts their name on the product is the company which takes the responsibility from a consumer sentiment perspective. Okay. Probably all of you know examples of outsourcing. Let me just talk about two of these, because these kind of highlight what we've talked about a lot. A lot of companies outsource to electronics company outsource to Flextronics, which is a large contract manufacturer. They make iPhones, other types of phones, other types of products. Okay? Why do they do that? Well, Flextronics can then aggregate demand in different products, different market segments, and then not have to deal with a lot of variability that individual companies face. But the problem is these electronic products are very different. So if Flextronics has to have a separate production group for each product, then where's the benefit from aggregation? There's not as much benefit. Well, Flextronics is able to still benefit from aggregation because they use a lot of computer-controlled machines to do these PCB circuits and to lay out the electronics, where switching from one part to the other is just switching the program on some of these machines, right? So that way they can have flexible technology and still benefit from aggregation. Li & Fung, we already talked about once before, is a large company which is very popular in the apparel industry. They book capacity with all sorts of suppliers of yarn, fabric, stitchers, things like that. And then, if let's say you are a apparel brand of clothes, all right, you could just produce the expected volume, and when you have overflow demand, you go to Li & Fung and say, I need this shirt in 4 weeks. Okay? Li & Fung can cater to short-term orders because they have contracts with hundreds of suppliers. So if not this supplier, they go to some other supplier. They know the capability of suppliers, they know their cost, and they book capacity in advance because they expect a lot of these short-term orders from many different apparel brands. Right? So again, they're aggregating the variable part of demand of 10, 20, 50 companies. When they aggregate that, they don't see as much variability as the individual companies see. And so they can book capacity in advance, they can forecast capacity requirements, and do this thing. Okay, let's move on to total cost of ownership. So one thing that became really clear in this whole issue of outsourcing was, if you are sitting in a company trying to figure out whether a certain component should be outsourced or not, and you want to compare the cost advantage, and you're looking at other factors as well. So you call up your accountant, you say, how much does this particular part cost me to make? And the accountant might say, well, this costs us, $3 to make this part. And then you call up some suppliers, and they say, we can give you this part for $1, and you factor in the transportation costs, which is $0.50 per piece, and you say, okay, I can get it to my door from outsourcing at $1.50. I'm making it for $3. Makes a lot of sense to outsource. You outsource, and then after a year, you evaluate your costs. So your cost should have gone down by $3 per part that you bought, right? Well, $1.50, because you used to be $3, and now you're $1.50. So if you make 100,000 parts, and you outsource them, your cost should go down by $150,000, $1.5 per piece, right? But companies often found that the cost saving was not realized. They were expecting to save $150,000, and maybe they saved $50,000 or $60,000, not the whole amount. So what do you think could have gone wrong? Why didn't they not save all the money they expected to save? Susan? Well, one thing could be that the estimates were off, so transportation costs went up, maybe fuel prices went up, something like that. So costs move over time. When you're making the decision, you have to work with the forecast of the cost in the coming 3-5 years. because you can't just use the cost today. These costs might change over time, right? So that's one issue that sometimes happen. You can't use the oil prices today, the transportation costs. You have to look at, okay, what could these costs be in the next few years? What's the worst case, the expected case, things like that. And so one thing could be you just looked at the current cost and the cost moved. Excellent point. What else could have happened? Anybody who's very much into accounting, did an accounting internship, did well in accounting courses? Somebody must have done well in accounting courses. Okay, so when you have cost per piece, okay, so let's talk about this. So the cost per making this would include materials cost, cost of the plastic, the metal, raw materials cost. What else would it include? Labor. If some part of it was made over machines, then the cost of running the machines. Anything else? Just material, labor, that's it? Overhead cost, right? So maybe the machines and the labor which produces this, there's 2 managers or supervisors overlooking them. Their salaries are going to get factored into this. That was done in a certain facility. Maybe it used up 25% of the facility, so 25% of the rent, 25% of the energy cost will get assigned to this, right? Maybe you had to insure the inventory of raw materials you carry. That insurance cost would go to this, things like that, right? Blah, blah, blah. Now some of these costs when you outsource would go away. When you outsource this and buy the finished product, you don't buy raw materials anymore. That cost goes away, right? What about the labor cost? Is it going to go away when you outsource or not? Yeah, so there's a price you pay, but we're talking about, so we think about it this way, some costs are going to go away and then we're going to pay the $1.5. So that's there. The supplier's labor cost is part of the $1.5, but what if instead of producing this, I start buying this from a supplier, which of my costs go away? So what about my labor we used to make this? Does that labor cost go away or not? Yeah, at least over the long run. So maybe short term I can't fire them all at once, and maybe union contracts, other limitations, we have to pay them a leaving package, but either I will reassign them to other products and then they will be used up, so they're not sitting idle, so there's no cost to that for this product, or they'll be let go, whatever, right? So that potentially can go away. Maybe not the first few months, but eventually. What about a manager's cost? The managers who are looking after this production. You still need managers to receive the product, store it. Some of the labor will be used in receiving as well, so that some of that might stay. But you might still need managers to forecast the demand, plan the inventory, place the order with the supplier. So maybe instead of 2 managers, you have 1 manager, but the whole cost didn't go away because somebody still has to manage the relationship with the supplier. Select the supplier, go check their quality. There's a lot of managerial stuff to do with procurement and ensuring quality and all of that. So maybe 1 manager still stays. So that cost didn't all go away. Okay, what about rent, utilities, things like that? They didn't go away. You still have the building. Maybe you used to have accounting overhead because somebody has to do the accounting and the books for this product, and so that cost was being charged by some metric. Now maybe the accounting department charges you less because it's easier to do accounting when you just buy a finished product versus do accounting of all the raw materials and stuff, but maybe some of that cost still stays, right? So when I say this cost me $3 to make, if I outsource it, I don't save all the $3. Maybe I save only $2. And the $1 still stays. That's called sticky cost. They don't go away with outsourcing. They still are going to be there. So you can't compare $3 versus $1.5. You should compare $2 versus $1.5 because $1 was a sticky cost is not going to go away. Okay? So that is the main point about total cost of ownership. What it says is find the total cost for doing it in-house and find the total cost for outsourcing it, including the cost to who's going to place the order, who's going to select the supplier, who's going to ensure quality, some of the overheads will still stay. So the total cost of going to a supplier should include the overheads that are still going to stay after outsourcing, and then compare the 2 numbers because that is apples to apples comparison. Don't just compare cost of purchase and transportation to cost of making in-house. Okay? So that's the whole idea. Now, we don't have to go through every single detail in the slides. You can look at these slides when you do the case. The case will have some of these costs, may not have some of these costs, but the point is to make a comprehensive list of costs and evaluate which ones are sticky, they're not going to go away, which ones are going to go away, which ones are partially sticky, they will reduce but not totally go away, and then find exactly how much cost will go away, and then the remaining cost which does not go away, add it to the outsourcing option. Because when you outsource, you're still going to have this cost too, and then compare the two options. Okay. Again, acquisition costs are all costs associated with getting something to your facility. So buying it and getting something to your facility. They will include things like supplier selection, doing the contract with the supplier, taxes and duties, the money you pay the supplier, the money you pay transportation, receiving it, quality control upon receiving it, putting it away into the shelf. All of that is all acquisition costs, cost to acquire something. Ownership costs then include costs that go from, okay, when you've acquired something till you use it in your end product or till you sell it to the customer. Because let's say you were doing production in-house. You could, let's say this was, let's imagine this is not a stapler, this is something that gets used up in another product. It's a part. If I'm doing production in-house, I could have an assembly line producing this part, where this assembly line feeds directly into another manufacturing operation which produces a final product. So I basically have zero inventory of this part. As soon as it gets produced, it gets used up. Every day I know my production plan for the final product. I replicate that production plan for this part, and this part gets produced exactly as needed, just in time. Now if you go to outsourcing it, the supplier might be far away. The supplier is not going to supply you just in time anymore. You're going to get truckloads full of this stuff. So when you store that inventory, there's going to be inventory holding cost that was not part of acquisition costs. So in acquisition cost, you got all the cost to acquire the part, but now because you're acquiring it in bigger batches, you've hired inventories, you need warehouse staff to look after the inventory, store it, things like that. That is called ownership cost, the cost to now just own it till you use it. Because the time between getting it and using it might grow longer now because the supplier is further away. Before, you produce it and use it right away. Right? So these costs may also go up. Okay, and then the last one are post-ownership costs. These could again be different between your supplier and yourself, and they might be lower with the supplier. Imagine you produce something, but there are issues with it. Let's say you're a new car company struggling with high quality transmissions. Your transmissions keep failing, your car has reliability problems. You outsource transmission, automatic transmission production, you get them from a nice high-tech supplier. Now your transmissions are high quality, you limited that problem, right? So in terms of post-ownership costs, you'll have fewer recalls, you'll have fewer maintenances to do during warranty or warranty claims. So outsourcing might reduce some of these post-ownership costs. It's not always that these costs will go in one direction or the other, that ownership costs will always increase, they might decrease, or the acquisition costs will always increase or decrease. Any of these costs could go either way depending on the situation. Right? So post-ownership costs have to do with reputation, warranty, liability costs, environment and social costs, and supplier capabilities. Okay? Hey. Now just to show that these costs change over time, if you look at the example of producing a mid-range computer server, okay? Now I don't have the latest cost, so this is a little bit old example, but in 2005 and 2008, if you did the total cost of outsourcing analysis, TCO analysis, between those 3 years, it was cheaper on a total cost basis to get the computer server built in Asia. But after 2008, freight costs went up, Chinese currency appreciated, wages went up in China, and so it became cheaper to make the same server in North America. Okay? So these costs move, so you have to be kind of looking at it from a long-term or future-oriented perspective when you look at these costs. Okay? Then some of these costs are can change your business model. If you, Zara for example does part of their production in a high cost some high cost European facilities, but because of that higher total cost, they can recover that total cost because their time from design to market is very short. So a new fashion trend takes off, they have the clothes in their stores in 2 weeks, right? And the latest or hottest trends, they sell at full price, so they don't do as many markdowns. So even though they have higher cost, their business model supports it, and they can live with the higher cost, still make more money. So even when you do a total cost comparison, at the end of the day, you might still say total cost is cheaper this way or the other way, but I'm still going to go with the more expensive option because it allows me to do other things in my business strategy. Okay. And the third thing is things like reputation issues can take a long time to fix. So if you make children's toys and there's lead in your toys, there'll be a time before parents start trusting your toys again. Okay. Now some of these costs are hard to quantify. We already talked about sticky costs. We already talked about hidden costs or less obvious costs. They're not really hidden. I mean, they're less obvious. A lot of people don't think about them. But this is something that you also have to factor in, which is really hard to factor in. If you outsource something, what does that do to your future options? It could reduce your future options or it could increase them. Let's say you have an R&D team and you make hand tools and you also work on making motors for the hand tools. If you outsource production of motors, the same engineers could maybe work on something else, or maybe you have more engineers to work on developing new products, so it increases your options in terms of how many new products you can launch, but it might decrease your options in terms of motor technology. You might not be able to develop the next best motor or something because you don't have that in-house anymore. So you also have to factor in future, which direction are we going towards? Is it going to give us more options in that direction or less options? Okay, where are we? We have just one more last slide. Oh no, we have 2 more slides and we're good on time. Okay. Now let's look at an example from Midwest. This is from 2011. It's a little bit of an old picture. A lot of you might have already seen it, but I like this picture because they communicate a lot of information in this one picture. So here in the solid black line is manufacturing output of the US over time, and it's on a scale where the 2008 volume is set to 100. So if you're 95 in a year, you're 5% less than 2008, right, and so forth. Okay, so whatever the total output of manufacturing was in 2008, that is indexed to 100. So you can compare the other years versus 2008. Okay. And you can see that manufacturing output was going up till 2008. Then it crashed, the recession. Okay. Then it picked up again. So in just about 1 or 1.5 years, it was back to 95, and it crashed to 85. So 15% drop in 1 year, and then 10% recovery the next year off that drop. So you went down by 15% to 85, then you came back to 95. Okay? So that's a pretty fast recovery in terms of manufacturing output. Now let's look at the dotted line, which is the workforce employed to produce this output. So workforce is going down steadily at a slow pace to 2008. Then it dropped sharply because when companies cut their production, if you produce 15% fewer product on average, you're going to need less workers to produce it, obviously. But then when it picks up again, workforce doesn't pick up. What do you guys think happened?
Automation.
Right, because when your volumes pick up, the companies kind of just had this jolt. They say, okay, our production volume can drop so significantly, we want to go to a low-cost process. Maybe they already had some ideas to be lower cost. Maybe they couldn't implement them because of union issues, other issues. Maybe it was not an urgency. They were looking at increasing market share. The volume is going up. When you're in a growth mode, cost savings has less priority. So you're in a growth mode for a long time before 2008. So all those cost savings ideas, suddenly you put them in place. Some of them may include automation. Some of them may just improve a better way to do something which needs less employees, things like that. And so suddenly you have a recovery, but not in terms of employment. So I found it really interesting because in this part here, before 2008, you had a lot of outsourcing going on, but during the outsourcing you had employment falling, but not as sharply. But right after the recession, the ratio between production output and employment really changed in a significant way. So part of that obviously is automation. Right? So 1/3 of the jobs kind of fell. No, 1/3 of the job lost were a combination of automation and outsourcing. Okay, so a lot of things that people have been looking at is when should production come back? Can companies move production back? So this reading kind of talks about that, which is the reshoring. When can a company bring their production back to the home country? Okay? And the nearshoring is moving to kind of like a close by country. Again, we'll do the total cost of ownership analysis to see how the costs are working. But then you also want to look at other factors that can hinder or help the reshoring effort. Let's say you used to produce something and you outsource it. Now you want to bring it back. Well, that thing also has its own suppliers, right? So if it was a transmission system, there are parts that go into a transmission system. If it was a shoe, there's plastic materials, leather that go into a shoe. Okay? So it's usually, if all of the supplier network also moved out, you can't just bring one product back, because then your suppliers will be that far, and it'll just not make sense to just buy everything and just assemble it here. That might make your supply chain less reactive. That may increase all sorts of costs because your suppliers are too far. So one key factor you also have to look at is the supplier network. There may be other supporting structures. So you might have heard this term of industry clusters, right? I'm assuming you have heard it in news or popular media. A lot of industries exist in clusters. So think about Michigan. The automobile industry has a cluster in Michigan, right? So why are all the automobile companies here? Why not one in Michigan, one in Nevada, one somewhere else, one somewhere else? Why is automobile concentrated in one state?
Started here.
Right, it started here. So a lot of times when a new technology starts, all the 3-4 companies that do that technology kind of branch off from one area where the technology starts, right?
Suppliers, of course.
Right, if you are at the beginning of this technology revolution and you want to start your company, you got to locate where the existing supplier base is. You can't locate too far from them. So again, you locate close to it, right? So based on starting conditions, often industries develop in clusters, not just one particular company separately, right? Then once that happens, why do they stick together? Why don't they just drift apart and then move? Well, there's cost to moving, but there's also a lot of support structure. So if one industry is in a particular state or area, what do you think all the training facilities that might grow around them, which can train employees in certain ways? The universities around them might be focusing their programs on that industry or that industry-specific program, right? So there's some universities in Michigan, they'll do like an automobile manufacturing specialization in their business school, for example, right? The other technologies that are relevant to that industry, the training might get concentrated there. In addition to training, the government might support that industry in different ways, where you have, they have some advantages to be there in that industry cluster. Then whenever a new company wants to start, let's say you want to enter an industry which requires a lot of knowledge in technology. How are you going to get the best employees for your company? Well, the best employees are where that industry is. So if you come to Michigan, you're going to get a lot of employees with a lot of experience in automobile industry, right? So you can hire them for your factory and start your own operations. So there are all sorts of advantages to these clusters. So when you're reshoring, if the whole cluster is outside, it might be very difficult to move just one company or one facility across the globe. Okay. Then the other factor we have to, we always have to be forward-looking. So the other factor we have to think about is also all the inputs that go, including skills and employees. If you think about the US, our skilled tradespeople are getting older than average workers in other industries. So with retirements, you can think 5-10 years down the line, you'll have a shrinking pool of skilled tradesmen. So if your industry depends on skilled tradesmen of a particular type, you have to factor that in. Are we putting more people into those programs? Are we going to have enough supply of the skilled tradesmen 5-10 years down the line or not for your industry to be in a particular area? Then the other thing that is kind of very interesting is more of an economic, without time, let me just make one quick comment. When Norway discovered a lot of offshore oil and gas, other industries went to the government and said, oil and gas is booming in Norway. They pay salaries we cannot pay, like the fishing industry. Fishing industry is not that profitable. We can't pay their salaries. All the good engineers, the good students, everybody who wants a good career is going to that one industry. When we run out of oil and gas, we're going to have no other industries that can compete on a global stage, right? Because you have only so much population, so many people are going to study for so many years, develop certain skills. If those people go to the industry which makes the most money because they can pay them the most, then other industries are always obviously going to suffer. So you cannot be world class in every single industry. It's just not possible because of these limitations. So Norway's answer was they did something they call, they have a fund where they take money from the lucrative industries like oil and gas. They put money in that fund. All Norwegians own that fund. I think right now every Norwegian is worth $200 million based on that fund divided by the population or something like that. And so they have that fund, so when oil and gas runs out, they will use that fund to kickstart new industries and make new investments, for example, right? So because of limitations in terms of not just capital, but also in terms of human limitations, you can't be the best of everything, so you have to look at where are the best people, and you have to kind of locate where the best people sometimes are.